Thank you very much, David. Um, I'd like to say a big thank you to David for asking me to talk to you about this, because I think this endeavour, this Belief in the Northeast project, is a great thing, and all your community activities and things. So thank you for making me a part of this, and thank you to Paul for managing behind the scenes here. Um, I put Linda's name here too because we very much did this together, and the publication we got out of it was a joint effort. And I have to say, most of the internal shots of the deanery that you see are Linda's amazing photography. This is a project that we did up till 2013. I haven't done a great deal on it since, which is a great shame, because we have an enormous catalogue of graffiti that we could still do a lot of work on. Anyway, this is what is going to become the main focus of the talk, but I have split it into five. You've got here an amazing survival of late 15th century wall paintings, and sandwiched underneath it and between it and a 13th century set of wall paintings is an absolute quilt, as it were, of intercut and superimposed graffiti of various sorts. So we'll look at that. So what I thought we'd do, taking belief in the Northeast as in its broadest sense, was look first at the context of the medieval priors' lodging buildings in which those wall paintings and the graffiti exist. If you like, that's the context of an institution that lived for and by belief. So that's first bit. Then I'll focus in on the medieval prior's chapel, which is the immediate architectural context. Then we'll look at the wall paintings themselves, and then the graffiti, and end up with some thoughts and implications, the sort of thoughts that Linda and I drew from thinking about this in a wider context of other works on medieval graffiti and their various manifestations. Okay. So first of all, the context of the prior's lodgings. Now, this is the modern day deanery. So the Dean of Durham lives in a complex built in and out of essentially medieval buildings. And the chapel that we'll be looking at is this portion here, which is the modern day deanery hallway and Dean's offices, and part of the Dean's house, his sitting room, etc., at the top. And I should say that at the time of the research Linda and I did, we were very grateful to the very Reverend Michael Sadgrove for and his wife and family for giving us access to their house, their home, essentially. It has a modern day external stairs to a door here, but we know from the architectural evidence that there would have been a medieval door at this level and beneath it in the medieval. I'll come back to that. Cora, shush! Sorry, my dog's going to bark. I knew this would happen. Thinking about the institutional context then, the priors originally in medieval monasteries and up till the 12th century or so, would have slept in the communal dormitory with the rest of the monastic community. But as we see them emerge as significant figures or monastic officers in their own right, we see them become endowed with or carve out for themselves suitably distinct lodgings from the 12th century onwards. Now, in terms of Durham, and I'm using a set of plans that were drawn up in 1911 and published in 1912 by the then Dean. So it's not a representation of how they are exactly today. But the area we're interested in, the modern deanery, is essentially this area. But note that prior to about 1140 or so, the old dormitory, the first dormitory, would have extended up the east end here. So our chief area of interest is this chapel building. But you'll see that it's many phases, and that's an important thing too. Because the lodgings were built over and out of some of the earliest fabric in the Cathedral Priory complex. And indeed, one wall's been fossilised from the very earliest known Norman work, probably about 1071 to 80. The undercroft and original Norman dormitory would have been here. And they dictated the position of and formed the basic wall frame for the present deanery hall, which would have been the former medieval prior's hall. When the monks moved from the east over to the west, where the present dormitory is, they moved certainly by about 1140, it released space in the east to develop as a distinct prior's lodging. And even just a cursory look here will show you that, we're talking about a number of rooms and buildings of different dates. And that in itself reflects the growing importance of the prior as, if not a prince of the church in the way that bishops were, certainly an aristocrat of the church with concomitant responsibilities for entertainment, for holding judicial functions, for all sorts of things. Hence, as we'll see, the glory of this set of buildings. Now, as a sort of a leftover from that original dormitory, the rear daughter channel is still embedded underneath the property. And
it's rather funny.
I remember Norman Emery showing me what you can see of it now. So there's the oldest part there surviving there that forms a wall. And I'm interested in this, which is the rear daughter. Now that space is fossilized in the existing deanery still to this day. It doesn't really have a function because it's this originally open space for the toilet, ordure, if you like. So having abandoned that old dormitory, they lowered the floor to make a hole. Lowering the floor gave you a new floor for the hall, but it also increased the overall height of what became the prior's hall. And there is still visible remains of some of the older windows from the original dormitory within the fabric. This is an elevation, if you like, sort of looking through the prior's hall and the anteroom there. The current roof dates to the 15th century, two phases in the 15th century. And this is a reconstruction that Kitchen had commissioned for the appearance of the prior's hall and its glory in the 15th century. So even that gives you some idea of the splendor of the main public rooms there. So I mentioned these plans come from Kitchen's 1912 book, and really from that time onwards, there hadn't been intensive study of any part of the prior's lodging. And it was at the invitation of Dean Sadgrove that we were brought in to look at the graffiti. But it gave us an opportunity to think again about these rooms and discover what we could. Having abandoned that dormitory and started to carve out prior's lodgings here with the frame of a prior's hall, etc. We see grand reconstruction from the 13th century onwards. Not only that, we have some inventories, historic inventories surviving that tell us about the furnishings and the movable bits and pieces that existed in some of the rooms. So from 1446, there's an inventory telling us about hanging cloths with St. Cuthbert's birds, cuddy birds presumably, and the arms of the church, more embroidered cloths, cushions for the refectory, numerous cups, gilt, decorated, 211 silver spoons. You get the idea here of quantity and value. And one of my favorite things is some cups made out of coconut shells, which must have been incredibly rare in the Middle Ages. If we go back to this plan, this area here, the former prior's solarium, is the current drawing room and lobby in its 18th century and modern form. And this is it inside. But these were carved out of two large rooms built one on top of the other in the 14th century. One was a dining room and living room for the prior's domestics, his domestic servants, and the upper chamber was for the prior and his own immediate retainers. So Prior Fosser, for example, spent huge sums on building and glazing these two separate chambers in the early 1340s. Now, what you see in this beautiful image of what looks like a sort of classical 18th century drawing room is partly fashioned out of that original solarium, but it's been subdivided and an 18th century coved ceiling has been put in. However, when you go out into the lobby and staircase entrance, you can get an idea of the full height and length of that prior's solarium, or sort of private hall, as it were. And this is restored, but surviving medieval fabric. So that gives you a better idea of it. Between the rafters, the roof's been taken away to allow light in. Now, obviously, that would have been covered over in the medieval period. And again, there's a kitchen period conjectural reconstruction of what that upper room would have looked like. Again, very grand. And again, the inventory tells us about a bed with hanging curtains, rugs, canopies, striped hangings, cushions. All these textiles were an incredible investment in wealth for the medieval period. And it was very fine decoration, and the fabric of the building itself, from what we can tell, must have been very fine too. And the grandeur of this solarium is telling us something about the role of the prior, how he liked to, or even was expected to entertain guests, giving counsel to the great and good of the region. So these are rooms that would have been seen by the great and the good of the region, as I say. Now, this is a view of the outside of what would have been these two medieval rooms with the solarium at the top. And there is still a surviving staircase that would have linked the two rooms in the upper and lower halls in the medieval period. Amongst the other suites of rooms in this complex, there would have been the prior's study and justice room over here. There's a mid-14th century mention of it being built up against the chapel, so it would have been over here, I guess. Yeah. And then that's a view of some of it. This is a surviving 15th century roof. And then again, we have the so-called King James's room, which has remains of an early to mid-14th century window and a very fine 15th century roof, which is decorated with these beautiful sort of fluorited bosses that include, for example, the badge of Prior Castle. So again, it's telling you something about the investment in fabric, an expected audience for this fabric who would appreciate it, and the details of heraldry, presumably picked out in paint and gilding at the time. So that's a brief sort of introduction to the context of the prior's lodgings. So let's focus now in on that chapel. Now, there are several indications that it must have been built about 1244 to 54. Some of these indications are architectural, comparison of detail, for example, with other building in the region of this time. And I think we also have a document of 1254 talking about a commemoration being held in the chapel, so it had to have been built by then. Okay, so let's have a look. It's a two-story structure. I should say that, as with many buildings in and around Durham, as you'll probably be used to, or anywhere else for that matter, that is medieval fabric, we tend to see an 18th century vision that is built out of or masking or built onto medieval essential fabric. And that's what we're going to see here. There's a lower story This is what it looked like when it was being restored. Medieval inventories suggest it was a storeroom in the Middle Ages, not a chapel. And that was kind of a disappointment to Linda and I. We were hoping for glories of two-story chapels, forerunners for St. Stephen's Chapel at Westminster and this sort of thing. However, the arrangement of having a storeroom beneath a chapel is certainly not unusual. So Prior Crawdon's chapel of the early 14th century at Ely, and the Bishop of Durham's own chapel at Durham House in London of the late 13th century had this arrangement of vaulted undercroft or storeroom with a chapel above.
Pam, sorry to interrupt. I'm really sorry to interrupt, but this is exciting. Can you just go back to the previous picture?
Yeah.
Those steps are Frosterley marble.
Yes.
We're doing a Frosterley marble survey.
Oh!
Lots of the volunteers are doing a Frosterley marble survey, including some that are here tonight. That is a major discovery. I've been looking at all your pictures, looking for any sign of Frosterley marble.
Oh, right. Okay.
Those steps, I'm certain they're Frosterley marble.
It looks like it from here. Yeah.
So what sort of depth? I'm really sorry to interrupt, but if I'd left that till the end, you wouldn't have known which picture I was talking about.
Norman Emery will have a detailed record of the survey that was done, and what point these steps were actually put in, because they're there for an altar, but it's a case of when they were put in.
Yeah, that's what I can't be sure looking at them. But anyway, sorry to interrupt, but that's for me, that's massively exciting, and probably for some of the other people watching as well. Cool. I'll shut up now. I'll remute myself.
No, it should be good, because I haven't even really thought about that. I never noticed. Thank you. Okay. But yeah, contact Norman. So our previous dean had the chapel made into and consecrated as a chapel for quiet contemplation. It's a beautiful space, actually, and he took as his theme sort of Cistercian influence of simplicity, and it's there for public access on certain days. So very good use of that medieval space, I think. However, that's what exists down here at this level. We'll come back. Okay. But what I hope you can see are bits of medieval buttressing. And as we move in closer, we'll see that the 18th century sash windows are not at all respecting the original layout of windows, but we can catch some details of it. There's some there, and they would have looked there. Can you see? I think I've highlighted. We've got remains of 13th century lancet windows with thin columns at each side, what we call nook shafts, with capitals and bases originally. And they would have looked like those that are restored and survive at both the West End and the East End. So these long, thin windows would have featured in the chapel. So this is the space. Here are the suggested locations for these lancet windows. This is, remember, the chapel undercroft. So I haven't got a plan here of the upper floor yet. But what I want to draw your attention to is we got a chance to look in this space here, which was originally a laundry at the beginning of the 20th century, but is a sort of was an odds and sods room. However, the point is that there are still some remaining buttresses, these sort of pilaster buttresses survive. Not only that, but I was able to see that there was a string course that ran right round the buttresses and along the visible remains of the wall, but had been hacked off. Yeah. So that tells us that this now enclosed building and basement.
Why wouldn't it let?
Pardon? Sorry. It was almost completely freestanding, not wholly, because there's a door here, as we'll see, that we believe must have been connected in some way with a flying bridge or staircase or timber gallery or something to the rest of the lodgings remember, this is all later medieval. So in the mid-13th century, this is partially freestanding, but there's also a documentary reference to it being connected at one point to another building, but more or less freestanding. How do we know it's a chapel? Well, apart from that reference, in terms of actual material confirmation, there are 2 surviving consecration crosses inscribed into the plaster beneath the 15th century wall painting. So that's their location. There would have been 12 points around the inside where the bishop would have anointed the wall, and there would have been candles lit from prickets, and there's still the hole for the iron pricket where the candle would have sat in these consecration crosses for the dedication of the building. Okay, and as I say, 1252, there's a mention of Prior Bertram having a commemoration, and he built and is said to have dedicated a chapel to St. Nicholas. So we think it all fits together, and this is the chapel. In terms of that mid-13th century original decoration, it's fairly sparse. Just tucked in here where the arrow is disappearing behind this door jamb, there is surviving mid-13th century wall painting. Now, the 15th century painting looks to have gone right over that. So that suggests that at some time after the mid-13th century, in the 14th or definitely by the 15th century, that door had been blocked up, plastered over and painted over. So that door goes out of use. There would have been an original door here, however, that we think remained in use, along with the one below for the undercroft. Now, the chapel would originally have risen, our 2 stories, as it were, whether the upper roof was closed in up to the rafters or open, uncertain. But and the insertion of another story in the 18th century to convert this into, a very genteel Georgian house suitable for the dean of a complex as important as Durham, means that it cut through the height. Okay, now that's the room up there looking east. However, if you look west, there are surviving substantial remains of the internal decoration of those mid-13th century original chapel windows with dogtooth decoration. There's more disappearing behind the curtain there. And there is amazingly some more mid-13th century wall painting surviving, decorating these windows. Now, one of the reasons for opening this talk with this context is that because it is essentially the Dean's home, very few people get to see it in the ordinary course of events. So I thought it was worth, opening up with that. Okay. So, thinking then about the extent and the height and the size of that mid-13th century Prior's Chapel made us look at other Prior's chapels in Benedictine and other houses, and we were hit with an immediate surprise in that Durham's is actually very large. If you look at most of these Prior's chapels, they tend to be small spaces over a parlour, for example. Okay, so you're getting quite a contrast. And that in itself, I think, tells you a lot about the relative importance of the Priors of Durham. But I think there's still questions about that. And it's something we'll come back to, having considered the graffiti. Okay, so getting to the main meat, if you like, of the talk, looking at the wall paintings themselves. This is it, the 15th century, late 15th century wall painting. It covers an area of about 6 meters by 2 meters. This text you see is at about 1.3 meters above the present floor. there are a couple of steps, as I recall, coming in from the medieval door. So the medieval floor would have been a bit lower than this, but not hugely, maybe, as much as a foot maximum, I think, as I recall. Now, some of these other features, these physical features, we'll come back to in the course of this talk. But I would like to point out that this party wall here is an insertion that, again, has divided up the space of the chapel. And the wall painting disappears underneath that. Now, it is not possible, it has not been possible to rip off the dean's wall coverings and plaster and everything to reveal more of this painting. But undoubtedly, if we're lucky, it's still under there, because this was covered over with, I think it was some sort of Hessian-like covering. And just before I come back to that and develop this more, I just want to point out that there is one piece of surviving heraldry from a period in between our mid-13th century wall paintings and this late 15th century set of wall paintings. And that's this late 14th, early 15th century piece of heraldry. Woo, come back. Where am I going? Sorry, overzealous use of the cursor. Now, it's not a graffito, although parts of it are inscribed. I think this is, it looks like Ermin's Tales to me. But when we realised where this was in terms of the stratigraphy, if you like, of the lime plaster and the wall painting lying in between, as it were, we wheeled off a picture of this to the College of Arms, and Blue Mountain Pursuivant came back saying this is the arms of John Hemmingborough, who was prior of Durham in the late 14th, early 15th century. Now, that presumably is there as part of an identifier for some decoration that he installed at that time. Because of the survival of the late 15th century paintings, we don't know what else was there. I don't know if there's going to be technology at one point that might be able to kind of read through these layers, but it's potentially a whole suite of decoration that was installed by Hemmingborough, and that was his heraldry to signify that that's what he'd done. Okay. Now, the wall painting was only uncovered in 1974. As I say, it had been covered in these sort of Hessian-type panels until then. We're seeing here a close-up of the Nativity of Christ. There he is, lying in the manger. There's the Virgin. Christ's resurrection. There he is, sort of striding out of the tomb. And there is a third episode here, which is the Annunciation. We'll come back to that. But the whole thing was conserved in 1983. And what it shows as a suite of images, as a complete concept, if you like, as we'd say nowadays, is scenes from the lives of Christ and the Virgin Mary. And David Park, who's an international leader really in medieval wall painting, dates the wall painting on the basis of armor and costume, the armor being on the soldier beside the tomb, and the various women's costume in particular, to about 1475 to 80. And beneath the figures are verses from a Latin hymn, The Bodily Joys of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So there we have the Annunciation scene there. It's very, a lot of the paint has obviously flaked off, revealing the plaster beneath it. So we've lost that, but it was conserved to show us this. So we've got the Annunciation, Nativity, Resurrection. Part of another scene disappearing out there that may well have been the Ascension. So remember, always bear this in mind, the original chapel would have been going off to the east there, towards a high altar, presumably. Now, this is a reconstruction of the painting done by Allardyce at the time of the conservation in 1983 that might make the sort of the imagery a bit clearer for you to discern. So there's a nice range of colour, nice range of scenes, and I'll talk about what is happening here. Basically, these very elaborate depictions of columns are dividing the scene. If you imagine a set of these scenes, almost like a cartoon, so scene by scene by scene is divided by these arches and columns, and that's a convention, if you like, of medieval sort of sequential narratives. So one thing to say is the extremely high quality of the painting is phenomenal, and certainly Dean Sadgrove and we too are very moved by contemplation of the image of the Virgin here. It does denote a great tenderness, a great serenity in her sort of vision of the Christ child having been born. I'd also like to draw attention to some of the detail of the costuming. Her gown is edged with jewels. We can move in closer, we can see. Now, there's huge quality in this. Not only the sort of three-dimensional depiction of pearls and cabochon, emeralds and rubies, but there's even fine detail here on the inside of that hem as well. It's really, truly beautiful. And again, David Park, that international expert in wall painting, has said that Durham Deanery painting is second only to those of Eton College Chapel in Windsor in Berkshire, which is again an amazing tour de force. So the Eton College Chapel wall paintings are the most considerable work of art in that college. They're the work of at least 4 master painters who, with their assistants, took 8 years to complete them, and they're more or less contemporary with the Durham Deanery paintings. These are depicted in the Flemish style, in grisaille. That means there's a very limited colour palette, although things like the crowns, the sceptres, halos, etc., are picked out in gold highlights. And on the north side are displayed miracles of the Virgin Mary, and this chapel was dedicated to Mary. On the south side of the chapel, there's a popular medieval story about a mythical empress. These phenomenal paintings were whitewashed over in 1560 under the orders of Protestant dispensation, and they were rediscovered in 1847 and only fully revealed when stalls, woodwork stalls that would have projected above these seating stalls, these canopy stalls. So I'll say that again. The canopies to these stalls were removed, and that revealed it. But there's an interesting thing here, that the Durham paintings must have been covered over before anybody could enact any orders at the Reformation, or especially under Edward VI, that elsewhere was removing faces, covering over, whitewashing imagery in the what we call iconoclasm, but what the Protestant reformers saw as sort of renewing the churches. So it escaped, thankfully, that iconoclasm, and we don't know why, and there are no accounts that we've found yet about who did it, why it happened, how they got a march on the iconoclasts. But there we go. So what we have are these bodily joys of the Blessed Virgin Mary with imagery and a Latin hymn. Now, thinking about belief, we've had the context of belief, an institution set up for and in and around belief, but this is actually, if you like, a tangible bit of actual belief as expressed and followed and worshipped at the time. And when, I have to say, Linda and I were sort of commissioned, as it were, to do the graffiti, and that's where most of our focus was. So at the time, we didn't spend so much time thinking about these paintings, and I've been doing a lot more about that since. A bit limited in my resources up here, but there's a lot more to be done, I think. There are certainly lots of primers of Hours of the Virgin that contain that hymn in Latin, and uses of Durham, so that is Salisbury and York. And these survived from 1478. Now, that hymn is a lot older than that. But the significance of the primers at this time in the late 15th century is that more and more elite, but more and more of lay people were using these primers, these books of hours, to read and sort of mutter to themselves in church when these hours were being observed liturgically. They also used them for private devotion in their houses. So there is an increase in this kind of contemplation. And as I say, the hymn exists within these primers. So I put up the 7 Joys of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is the theme of the imagery. And it's sort of paralleled, paralleled, if you like, I don't know what the word would be, with the 7 Sorrows of the Virgin. So there they are, the Annunciation, the Nativity. Our imagery does not show the Adoration. It does show the Resurrection, and the assumption is that the painting that's disappearing off to the east under the present wall covering is the Ascension. And it's a question of whether the other fragments existed further east, still towards the high altar for the chapel. And I just want to say a little bit more about the presentation of the imagery. So here we have on the left what survives today, on the right what we think was originally there based on Allardyce's reconstruction. So, as I said, with medieval imagery, you get separate episodes in the narrative conventionally indicated by these distinct architectural divisions. So you've got columns, you've got canopies. Especially when it's a narrative concerning the saints, the life of the Virgin, Christ, these biblical episodes. The arch is, I think, really not only a scene setter, but it denotes esteem, like a canopy of honor, essentially, just as images might be set under niches or canopies in 3-dimensional stonework. But parsing, if you like, sort of going into the grammar of the imagery, we have is the Annunciation scene, which precedes the birth of Christ. Okay, so we have 1 and 2. The originally visible iconographic elements of the Annunciation are Mary's attitude of humility, and that is depicted by this distinctive, I've lost my cursor, there it is, this distinctive way in which she's crossing her hands across her breast. Now, these gestures go back to Roman rhetoric, actually, in origins. Very interesting work about some of the gestures that survive into liturgy and survive in paintwork to depict certain modes of behavior, certain attitudes, certain things like speaking. The blessing hand has its origin in the gesture for speaking, for example. So this crossed hands across the chest is a gesture of humility. And these would have been reinforced by people seeing medieval mystery plays, medieval religious drama. The same gestures would be used as are picked out in manuscript and wall painting, stained glass, etc. A seat, again, or a canopy is part of the conventional depiction of the Annunciation. She's usually either reading a holy book or there's a holy book propped on a lectern. And what we don't have is the Archangel Gabriel making the Annunciation, Ave Maria, Gracia Plena. But usually in these depictions, the words, the Annunciation itself, is like a speech bubble. It's a scroll a medieval scroll unwinding that contains the words, and that is their kind of equivalent of speech bubble. So we have part of the Archangel Gabriel's speech there originally, or it was discernible, but alas, not the Archangel himself. So it's just sort of breaking down the scene. If we moved on to the Nativity, again, she's showing here humility at having given birth to God's Son. You've got Joseph in the background. You also have the midwife. That's something I'll come back to. Let's move on to just say that these conventions of the depiction that made them readily understandable by a medieval audience are repeated again and again and again in different media, different places over time. Okay, and that formulaic depiction made them accessible to the audiences, whether they were literate or not. Another aspect I wanted to think about is in the medieval mindset, the north, which is where our wall paintings are in that chapel, was where the Virgin Mary stood at the crucifixion. So the north was traditionally associated with the Virgin, but also with the Old Testament and the Old Dispensation. The south was where the beloved apostle St. John stood, but it was also associated with the New Testament, the New Dispensation. And that was reinforced in every church with figures at the chancel screen. This just happens to be a well-surviving French example, but all over the British Isles, churches would have had versions of this to be seen and understood, so that you would replicate those ideas in people's minds by seeing this day in, day out. So as our Durham Prior's Chapel continued to the east, there may have been 6 or even 7 of those joys. Now we know one is missing, the Adoration anyway, and sometimes the joys are depicted as 5 joys rather than 7. So obviously we don't know, but I'd say there's certainly room for another 2, having been there. Now, if the north side of the Prior's Chapel had imagery associated with the Virgin, we could ask, what might the south side have had? Was it imagery associated with Christ's mission, the new dispensation, or even St. Nicholas? Now, frankly, we don't know. I mean, St. Nicholas was a dedication, so that's possible, but we just don't know. On the other hand, St. Mary was one of the original dedicatees of Durham Cathedral, so it's possible that in the late 15th century, they made most of that imagery Marian. Interestingly, the joys of the Virgin were a subject of one of the so-called end-time mystery plays, a whole series of plays around the joys. But Mariolatry, or the worship, the role of the Virgin, was especially promoted by the Franciscans, and they especially, again, promoted the devotion around the 7 joys. So, there's much more to be thought of here than certainly Linda and I did at the time. One thing that the scenes, partly through their quality, the quality of the human emotion they're able to convey, and what they include, is the humanity of the scenes. So the presence of the midwife there. Now, there's no biblical justification for the presence of a midwife at the Nativity, the birth of Christ, but it was ubiquitous in medieval depictions. And I think that's because the presence of the midwife was so expected and so necessary for medieval experience. So they can practically conceive of, if you pardon the pun, having a nativity without a midwife. But it also brings in the humanity, the reality of the scene. And although the Virgin wouldn't have gone through labour pains, nonetheless, there's a midwife there to attend. But I think that also puts everyday people in these scenes in a way that you might not otherwise get. And when you think about it, there are the soldiers at the resurrection, everyday people in these scenes. And I think that's quite interesting. And it also ties up with we've got the gestures, humility, the Virgin's surprise, this wonderful surprise and delight at the resurrection. We've got a really vivacious Christ leaping out of the tomb. It's all trying to make an experience very real. And it's part of certainly late 15th century imagery and further sort of religious texts and movements towards trying to make people connect, to have empathy with these historical biblical scenes and episodes. So I think that's quite a moving thing as well. And furthermore, it came to us through, I think, the work of Margaret Harvey, that Durham Cathedral, as a convent, were making more moves towards getting involved in more public kind of liturgy and religious activities in the 15th century. It's as if they were trying to make themselves more relevant, which we might say nowadays, put it that way, and getting out there, more processions, more involvement, more what we might call popular religion. And these very sort of realistic depictions of emotion and events were part of that. And you could put these paintings in the context of that broader mission of the time. So rather than being, cloistered, secluded monks, it's very much getting out there and getting the message across to the public and being part of certainly a town and a regional, if not a whole north of England, kind of religious experience. Before I move on to the graffiti itself, and you've seen just a snapshot of it here, there are other physical indications and implications it's worth just quickly looking at. There are a set of deep square holes, all at the same height across the wall. Oh, how did I do that? There we go. There they are. Now, I think these may have been mortises for fixing some sort of wooden panelling, or even choir stalls to the wall. There may have been stalls, wooden stalls, seats going up the side of the wall here. The wall painting appears to post-date these installations, as there's no painting beneath. If we imagine that being a mortise, there might be some woodwork going right up to the edge of that scriptural border there for the verses. And that does have a parallel with the Eton paintings. They're the original sort of choir stalls, and the painting going straight up above it. And if there were wooden canopies, they must have come after that, so post-dating that. But another thought is that this line here is a hacked off string course. In other words, a projecting, moulded, sculpted form of stone forming a line across. That had to have been hacked away when whatever wooden panelling or choir stalls or whatever were inserted here. So even here, we've got a sort of sequence of events. Okay, so coming to the medieval graffiti itself. I was always taught by Alan Piper not to call this a palimpsest, because a palimpsest can only be a manuscript, I think. However, it is what you and I would call layer upon layer upon layer of intercutting images, names, bits of text. This ragged staff here, if you can see a bit of a ragged chopped off tree. There are all sorts of things, and it covers right over. Now, it's sandwiched in between those mid-13th century paintings. There's a layer of lime wash and stuff on top. There must have been this late 14th, early 15th century set of paintings or something there. And then there's the basis for this painting of the late 15th century. And in between, underneath the painting and that layer, is all the graffiti. Now, I have to say at this point, recording this was enormously difficult. And bless him, Dr. Anthony Massington from York and his student Sarah Duffy spent a long, long time trying to cover the whole wall with different sort of lighting effects and things and recording it to get the maximum the graffiti. It didn't actually work in the end for us. So Jeff Veach and another student volunteer did the whole lot again by throwing light over each sort of square foot of the wall from 4 different directions, and then combining the image digitally, we got the maximum sort of definition of all the graffiti. Okay. Now, it strikes me that many of these inscriptions are witness of otherwise unattested lives. Some are recognizable. There are names, surnames. Professor Doyle, the late Professor Doyle, said that the lettering was all of either the later 14th century or could have been any time during the 15th century. So again, that kind of fits in with being sandwiched under this late 15th century layer. So as I say, there are ragged staffs and all sorts of other heraldic signs. There are also some apotropaic or signs probably meant to perhaps defend people from evil. There's certainly some very, very familiar medieval graffiti that you'd recognize from all over the place. These variations on these sort of daisy wheels, very geometric shapes, etc. As I say, there's a ragged staff. This is usually associated with the Beechams of Warwick. And in fact, there is a connection. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, one of the Warwick lot, was a benefactor of the priory and was made granted confraternity in 1474, so right bang on the time. So was this one of his followers in some capacity? There's heraldry, some of which is identifiable, some of which isn't. There are Solomon's knots, there are names. Amazing. There's very, very clear boar. Now, this could be something to do with Richard III, or it just could be a heraldic boar, or somebody just fancied making a boar. It's actually got a lot of character. It's one of the characteristic parts of the whole. There's heraldry. This was identified as the Normanville family. There's a mention of a Normanville in one of a letter of the 15th century. It's a seating for a job on someone else's behalf. There's some unidentified shields. Okay, as an armed man, a man with he's got a knife or a dagger, which you'd kind of expect any male to have in the Middle Ages, once they'd passed puberty. But he's maybe associated with this shield, we don't know. I'm very proud I discovered this. I'm the first person ever to have mentioned the stave of music along here, because originally it just looks like a set of lines because their notation is slightly different from ours. And we got an expert from the university to look at it. It's a single vocal line using stroke notation, a form used particularly in the 15th century by experienced musicians to indicate the length of the different notes to inexperienced musicians. So it looks like it's part of a teaching mechanism for singers. It was inscribed, therefore, by somebody well-versed in the art of music. And we found that the chapel was, in fact, used to train and rehearse singers in the 15th century for liturgical celebrations in Order of the Virgin in the Lady Chapel. They used to train and practice in the chapter house, but they got chucked out. There's a record of somebody complaining about the noise. So maybe they got given or allowed to use the prior's chapel instead. There's also a bit of an Middle English proverb. This is interesting because it's bribery may expedite your cause more than truth. So it's a hitherto unrecorded, purely northern dialect variation of a proverb that's known elsewhere in, say, West Midlands dialect. So this is the first northern dialect recording of this proverb outside of a purely literary and manuscript context. And it tickled our fancy that it's, because it's about bribery, like maybe somebody who's really got a bit of a gripe against the prior in the household did this. Who knows? And there's all sorts of names. And it's quite poignant in the sense that there are people here whose names may not occur anywhere else in the historical record. Having said that, a lot of them have northeastern regional names or surnames known in the northeast, and some are known in record. So here are the Batemansons, for example. And that's a northern family. There are also the, oh dear, I've done it again. There we go. Thomas Ryle, as well as others. And Linda found Thomas Ryle, mentioned, listed in the Liber Vitae for Durham. Did a bit more research, and there are two Thomas Ryles. One was employed by the Prior Convent in Durham in several trusted and significant capacities, and the other, a younger Thomas Ryle, was a beneficiary and executor of this first Thomas Ryle's will. He too was had connections. He was a subdeacon locally. So those maybe two we can pin down. Otherwise, as I say, the poignancy is that there may be people here who's inscribed themselves into this wall and nowhere else in history at all. So just thinking about the location of the inscriptions, they go up as far as here. That's 1.9 meters above the present floor, given that the original floor was at least, I think, another foot below this. That's very high up. And even for some of these, you would have to have been standing on something to get away with carving your name or whatever else you were carving in theirs. So we reckon this rules out any notion of it being just stealthy, quick, surreptitious scratchings. This is stuff that people, we think, must have been permitted to do during the time at which the wall was covered in plaster and before that painting was instituted. They were given time and allowed to incise that wall. The only difference is the music, and it's been suggested that it's down here because it was somebody who's actually sitting down who'd be using that and reading it from a sitting position, which is interesting, ties in with the rehearsing or the teaching again. But the rest of it is not just, graffiti in the, cast it off sort of way that we tend to think. So, to round this all up and make some sense of it, thoughts and implications. There's a lot of work now on graffiti. If you're doing a graffiti project, you'll know this, about the way in which inscribing your name in the fabric of a building is never merely simple. It means something. It has certain implications depending on the context. And it could be that people here are identifying with, or sometimes, as we see from other contexts, defying the authority represented by the building. In some cases, inscription has been seen as a way of appropriating the building by people who have a grudge, for example. There's plenty of examples of this in the medieval past. We also have examples of people inscribing onto religious paintings, which can be a form of invocation, seeking help from the spiritual, the saint, the religious personage represented. So those are sort of general sort of ideas about graffiti in the medieval period. But in this specific context, let's think about what's going on. We know the prior had to entertain widely, impressively, and on a considerable scale. Hence, perhaps the size of this chapel. So who comes to this chapel? Perhaps all sorts of people that he entertains. He's dealing with in diplomatic senses, business senses, economic senses, all sorts of people like that. The religious function of the chapel seems to be more than that of a normal prior's household chapel, because it is considerably larger, for one thing. It has had 2 entrances, which again is very unusual. You only really need a direct access from the prior's lodgings. This had an external entrance. So it kind of suggests you're inviting a more public kind of audience or congregation into this place. From the early 15th century, we know that due to the leasing of other major manors at Durham, the importance and use of this lodging for the priors of Durham increased considerably, and they were present and used it more and more from the early 15th century. So maybe that says something about their willingness to invest such what must have been expensive wall painting artisanry at the time. There's a suggestion that there are wider pastoral functions that this chapel had than might be assumed for a normal household chapel, let alone a normal or even a prior's household chapel. There's a reference, for example, to a 15th century baptismal font in this chapel, which suggests that maybe it had certain parish functions for all of those employed, for example, by the priory. So maybe generations of their families were baptized, inducted into the Christian community in this chapel. And there are documents about disputes with the priory, with St. Mary le Beau and St. Mary the Less. And it's always been sort of assumed that it was maybe the St. Mary the Beau being created was the cause of the dispute, but maybe the gripe was actually over parish functions being assumed by the use of this chapel. That's something that, you know, we haven't been able to explore further, but it's quite enticing. There were many and regular important non-religious uses of this prior's chapel for the prior in his capacity as head of the house and as a major feudal landowner. So the homage of his feudal tenants took place in this chapel. He received the oaths of his own officials and those of the bishop and of the king when it was necessary in the north in this chapel. So it's got an amazing potential kind of audience, if you like. So we conjugated all, whatever the word is, thought about all this. And we wondered if what we're seeing in this massive graffiti over some lengthy time that must have been permissive, must have been permitted, must have been sanctioned as a kind of roll call over an extended time of household or administrative associates or allies of the prior. The prior particularly, because another characteristic of Durham is that there was a great rivalry between the prior and his household and the bursar of Durham and his household. So that took us to this idea of inscribing your loyalty, your identity as a prior's man, a part of this prior's familia, to borrow a term from contemporary Spanish sort of extended households, of inscribing that loyalty in the wall, being encouraged to do it, being seen to do it, and knowing you've done it with perhaps witnesses. So identity and protection in the way that livery and maintenance might do otherwise for secular households. Now, we know that there are medieval examples of people negating someone's name. We see that elsewhere. There are a few examples of that here. And it's usually seen in the context of somebody having done something bad, of having been written out of the community. So perhaps renegades, traitors, rebels are being written out of that familia or group of priors, people. But really what we're seeing are people being written into the sacrality of the building, that community, that association with the prior, but also by dint of the ceremonies that constantly took place there in the presence of the sacrament, they're being written into a spiritual as well as a social brotherhood and protection. So those were the kind of ideas we were playing about with having finished the project back in 2013. As I say, there's loads of scope, I think, for thinking more about this. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't overrun horribly. So, I'll try and answer questions as best I can, depending on my memory and what we did. So thank you very much.
Well, I will have to clap on behalf of everybody else. There's always a trouble with Zoom lectures. You finish your talk and there's a resounding silence. So I'm sure everyone thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you very much, Pam. That was an absolute tour de force. I think you really brought out the complexity of this site and the need for a kind of really close reading of the architecture and the stratigraphy of individual walls. I think that's really interesting. And your discussion of graffiti, I think, was wonderful. And I think one of the key points is that this stuff isn't illicit scratching, which is done kind of furtively. It's about making a statement. And some of this stuff, both the stuff you've been showing and anyone who's seen some of the other graffiti found at other sites across England knows that often it's incredibly complex, sophisticated stuff, which would have been, it's draftsmanship. And also some of it, but I think about some of the probably later post-medieval initials and things you see in the cathedral, on the effigies in the cathedral. It must have taken a really long time. These are big, big letters written into stone, even if it's soft stone. It's not something you can do quickly with a marker pen. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to...
When you think of that, it takes a while. Yeah.
So obviously one of our next jobs is going to be having to look at the post-medieval graffiti in the cathedral itself, which is absolutely hooching in. Right. If anybody's got any questions, can they pop them into the into the chat? And Paul, if you hold on for a moment, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I thought that was amazing. It's something about which I know nothing. Well, I know a little bit now, but before tonight, I knew nothing. I thought it was quite amazing. You've actually explained everything so well that at the moment there are no questions. Somebody has made a comment that presumably the clergy viewed the graffiti as desecration, but you've already suggested no, that can't really be the case, I think, haven't you? But a couple of things that occurred to me, and bear in mind that I spend most of my life thinking about Neolithic cup and ring marks and prehistoric rock art. First of all, I wondered whether, and I think you touched on this, whether it was as much the making of the graffiti, the doing of it, as much as what was actually left behind afterwards. So, because that's a way we're all learning to try and think about Neolithic carving now, that what's left behind might be significant, but perhaps it was the doing of it that was more important. And also, I just wondered, when you use the word palimpsest, that's exactly the word I would have used for it, whether it's correct or not to use it. I mean, palimpsest to describe landscapes and complex rock art panels and all sorts of things. So I wondered, within that palimpsest, are there clues as to the length of time that graffiti was being put on that wall? Does it look as though it's over a century, or was it sort of maybe constrained within a short period of time? And I wondered whether, when people were making were making the graffiti, perhaps they were aware of the fact that it would eventually be painted over or be plastered over, and the fact that the mark was left in the wall was important. So sorry, that's probably three different questions, but
okay, let me try and go through this. I think the making, the doing, the being seen to do it, and having the support of others around you who are letting you do it was probably very, very important. That's the reinforcement of perhaps of those connections that people had. I'm in the Prior's Chapel, I'm being allowed to do this. Here are several people who are saying, go on, this is what we do. It's like putting your name in a roll of order or something. So yes, I think the doing, as with many aspects of the Middle Ages, is very important. So it's not an end in itself. What they used, I don't know. I mean, everybody, kind of carried a knife at least. So they've got implements that they can use. There are definitely different depths, widths of incision different types of incision. There's different hands, in terms of how thickly people are leaning into it, etc. So I guess they mainly use, knives, daggers, whatever they've got. What was the other thing?
Oh, well, the other thing that I'd asked you was there an indication, or did you get any indication from looking at it what the time scale of it was? Whether it was whether it was over generations or whether it was a short period.
I think I'm right. I mean, the longest it can be is sometime between the say late 13th, early 14th century and the 1470s. Okay, but if you remember that Hemmingborough coat of arms, that's there from the early 15th century at the latest. So I think it's a slice of time in the 15th century before those paintings go up. So maybe 75 years or so, maybe 60 to 70 odd years, I think. Okay. But, that's several priors worth.
So it's a tradition that went on for a long time, and it obviously wasn't stamped out. It was obviously perfectly reasonable to go and whoever was doing it.
Seems to be. I think they must have known eventually this is going to get covered over. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, I've never come across any sort of expenditure records for the paintings going up or anything like that. So, that's the fascinating thing. If it was allowed to be like that for 60 odd years, max, say, even that is pretty phenomenal, I think.
Yeah.
I thought Richard asked about the music.
Yes, we got to that one.
We got somebody, I can't remember the occasion. We were in the Dean's Hall, the Prior's Hall, and there was a piano. Somebody saw this. It was part of the music department, and he played it. He played as near as we can get to the modern version of it. And that was one of those moments where the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It was that contact, sensory contact with something from the past. Hearing it was just sensational. So I haven't heard it sung, but I have heard it played in the modern piano.
Oh, that's great. Couple more questions coming in. Did any of the graffiti appear to have any relation to any of the paintings in terms of the location on the wall?
No, not that we can tell, because obviously where we see the graffiti is where the 15th century painting has fallen away. So we're just seeing the space underneath. But no, not in the way that you get, say, Italian and Spanish inscriptions into the images. I don't think when they did this graffiti, I don't think they had any idea what was going to turn up there by the end of the 15th century. So I don't think there's any spatial connection between the imagery and the graffiti.
Okay. Another question. The idea that the graffiti was permitted, do you think that extends to other churches, e.g. parish churches as well?
I think it may do in some cases. I mean, it's a different way of thinking about things, isn't it? I read a really interesting book, I've forgotten the name of it now, about the way in which walls, portions of walls in churches were effectively whitewashed over and used as a parish notice board. And you inscribed into that bit of the wall. And then we could plaster it over, lime wash it over, whatever, and start again. So, in the way that, if you think about how many sort of notices we used to put up before we sent emails and texts, they were right into the walls. So if you extend that, it may be that some of the graffiti is again permissive. Now, Anthony Massenson did a study of the graffiti in Thirsk, I think it was, and he found a lot of it was on columns or doorways where people might be leaning during the mass or other religious ceremonies. And he found a lot of that was kind of at shoulder level. So if you imagine just kind of nonchalantly leaning against it and inscribing. Now, given that people could get really quite litigious about where they stood in parish churches in order to be able to see the consecration, when the wafers lifted, etc. It may have been a way of inscribing their presence and laying claim to a space, before pews. Pews make everything different. But if you've got a fairly fluid space, people by habit, by preference, and as I say, ultimately by litigation, have preferred spaces in churches. So maybe some of the graffiti is a way of laying claim to their space.
It's interesting. Someone's made the comment, why does graffiti have to be disapproved of? Well, apparently it's not here, is it? Really? That's a modern sort of attitude. Yeah. Maybe it's more to do with the modern use of the word.
Yeah.
Somebody else saying most people couldn't read or write. So is it clerical people making the graffiti?
Well, clearly there's a mixture, I'd say. Right. I don't think it's all clerical. I mean, we've got the Rye Hill connection. One is a servant of the prior. When I say servant, I mean it's quite a high-standing office of the officer for the prior. The second Rye Hill, who it might be, is a subdeacon. He's in clerical orders. Some people are clearly literate. Some people may not be the ones putting in a lot of the images and things. There is a very odd thing in there that looks for all the world like a beef burger. I don't know what that is. So I think there's a mixture. I think it's literate and illiterate people there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not their literacy that connects them. It's their connection to the prior in his household that is potentially
there's a question. Could some of the graffiti signatures be a way of recording patronage? So
potentially. If you mean patronage in the way that maybe the Hemmingborough painting is, perhaps not, but there may be some aspects of that, with some of those more ornate names. Mm-hmm. Some of the way in which I think it's Batemanson is written, John Wrighton, is it? I mean, those are deeply carved and quite complexly carved. So, this may be patronage even on a small scale. I just don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, it might be one step removed, like the Ragged Staff, if it's got anything to do with the household of, who was it? The Duke of Gloucester, who gets admitted into confraternity of the cathedral. It may be part of his household or there temporarily. Mm-hmm. So, it could be.
Yeah. And then interesting question, a very obvious question, I suppose, but why the change of attitude around graffiti, which is then covered over and the painting made? Something's obviously changed.
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, that would take more research really into the nature of the priorship, the relationship with the wider world. Does the competition with the bursar's household, for example, does that lessen by the end of the 15th century? Is it more important to have, stonking top-class decorated prior's chapel to take people to? Is that more important? I don't know.
Somebody's asked, could the space have been used as a schoolroom? But I think you've already said that it was used for teaching singing.
Certainly, we think for teaching music, that aspect of schooling, and given that music is one of the liberal arts or whatever, and it would have been part of the curriculum. Yeah, I mean, yeah, but it's the tantalizing thing is, what kind of people are going in there? If it was ever used for baptisms, I mean, you're opening up a whole different world of how that space was used.
Yeah, that was extraordinary. I'm going to think about
who protected it. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I looked at some of those Eton Chapel paintings, and they've had the faces removed. So, even though they get whitewashed over in 1560 or whatever it is, somebody's gone for the faces. There's iconoclasm there. Somebody stepped in, and we know that there was an iconoclastic dean at one point, right? I think the earliest part of the Reformation, when they took out the statues on the Neville screen, etc. But somebody took steps to preserve this, and that is fascinating in itself.
Lots more thinking to be done.
I think so.
There's several messages coming in saying thank you very much. It was brilliant. So
I think we'll
all the
probably
questions. And if I could just say as well, as an aside, I apologise again for interrupting you, but to see New Frostley marble.
Right.
And I know there are people here. I know it's probably, I guess it's 19th century, but even so, it's still important to find some New Frostley marble that close. Well, not that close.
I'm sure Norman will know because
I'll contact him and ask him about it. Yeah,
great.
So thank you very much.
I think we'll draw a line there. Thank you so much for that, Pam. That's absolutely fascinating. I've heard you talk about this before, but having now been out hunting for the graffiti ourselves, I'm afraid we've not found anything quite as spectacular as that. We've got some nice pencil sketches of World War II fighter planes. If anybody's interested in taking part in our graffiti survey, I'm just going to put the link to the project in the chat, or if you just Google "Belief in the Northeast," you will find our website and you can contact us.